Hello, my name is Alexander Boxer, and I'm very honored to be part of this virtual Voynich conference. The article I contributed is called Fingerprinting Gibberish, a quantitative comparison of the Voynich and Sloan manuscript 3188. I wrote the article to share two things. The first is to call your attention to a new transcription I prepared of the Voynich manuscript, and which I've made freely available on GitHub. The second component of my article uses this transcription to perform a simple quantitative comparison of the Voynich with another text, Sloan manuscript 3188, which was written by John Dee and Edward Kelley in the late 1500s, and which contains a historically important sample of gibberish. These two texts exhibit several intriguing similarities, but my analysis shows dissimilarities that I contend are deeper and more compelling. So now let's discuss each of these items in a bit more detail. First, the transcription. Why a new transcription? Well, I like puzzles, and a few years ago, I decided to give the Voynich a try. I wanted to focus on the text more than the images, and I wanted to focus on it deeply. So I began to type it out, character by character. At some point, I reached the final manuscript page and figured I may as well share it. So I uploaded it to GitHub, along with some of the Python tools I've been using to analyze it. For those of you who are unfamiliar, GitHub is a web service where people can host and share their software projects. My project lives in a repository called Voynich Attack, which you can access on the web at github.com/alexanderboxer/Voynich-attack. You'll notice that the landing page on GitHub doesn't look like a normal website. That's because these are code repositories. But I placed some basic navigation links in the README section at the bottom. Those of you who are familiar with Git and GitHub know that you can get a copy or clone of the entire repository using the commands in this green button here. For most of you, though, I figure the extent to which any of this will be useful is just the transcription itself. A simple, albeit somewhat clunky way to get it is just to navigate to the file, which is called vms.csv, right-click on the raw button, and click Save Link As. The file is a plaintext CSV. That stands for comma-separated values. In other words, it's a spreadsheet. And if you open it, it will open your default spreadsheet application. So what do we have here? Well, it's an array, or spreadsheet, where each row is a line of text and each cell contains one token. Empty cells are filled with a $sign. Altogether, the file consists of 33,669 word-like tokens, comprising 147,485 letter-like characters. The transcription covers 197 manuscript pages. That's all pages of block text. There are 36 pages which are not included. These are pages either dominated by illustrations or where the text cannot be reduced to an ordered sequence. I typed everything out by hand, primarily from the digitized edition of the Yale University Library. In a few instances where finer detail was required, I used the lovely 2016 facsimile edition. But is there really a need for a new transcription? Well, as I write, the impetus to create a new Voynich transcription arose entirely from personal curiosity. The effort was not undertaken to supplant or impugn any of the existing transcriptions of the manuscript. All transcriptions of the Voynich manuscript must deal with the challenges of determining which characters are distinct and which are variants, and whether certain sequences of characters should be grouped as one token or several. Accordingly, all transcriptions of the Voynich, ours included, possess an unavoidable element of subjectivity. For this reason, the convenience of a single sanctioned transcription of the manuscript may be illusory. Instead, the community of Voynich researchers may be better served by multiple independent transcriptions. In other words, I'm not trying to sell anything here. If you want to use the transcription, that's great. If not, that's fine too. Now, as you saw, the Voynich transcription isn't the only thing in the Voynich Attack repo. The repo hosts, in addition, a library of comparison text, as well as various tools written in Python to facilitate their exploration. I won't discuss these in any detail here. I introduced them a bit in the paper, but the goal was to streamline the following sorts of operations. So here I have open a Python session, and I want to compare the Voynich with, let's say, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Caesar's Gallic Wars. And I want to do this in a way where I don't have to read and parse these texts every single time. So I can load them from a module I've made called Corpora, where these texts have already been converted to objects of a class I've defined. And these objects have some basic attributes, which let me retrieve their token and character lists, and their original data frame for slicing and dicing. These objects also have some basic methods that let me look at their token and character n-grams of any rank. There's no limit to the number of texts I can reference in the corpora module, and so, for this project, I created one called Enoch for the Enochian of Sloan manuscript 3188. The second part of my article uses these tools to perform a simple quantitative comparison of the Voynich with another text, Sloan manuscript 3188, which was composed by John Dee and Edward Kelley between 1581 and 83, and which contains extended passages written in an invented gibberish language called Enochian. A connection between Dee and the Voynich was first proposed by Wilfrid Voynich himself, at least as early as 1921. Moreover, since Dee's associate Kelley is assumed to have invented the Enochian language, the suggestion that Kelley, Dee, or both was somehow involved in creating the Voynich, perhaps as an elaborate hoax to sell to the Emperor Rudolf II, has been explored by a number of authors. It is not my intent to evaluate this hypothesis in any detail. Rather, I simply wanted to see to what extent Enochian and Voynichese exhibit similarities or differences. What I found is that certain key characteristics, or fingerprints of Enochian, are not to be found in the Voynich, suggesting that these two texts probably do not share any deeper connections, whether direct or indirect. Now, as I'm sure is well known, John Dee, who was an English mathematician and occasional advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, made a concerted effort to communicate with angels during the later decades of the 1500s. To this end, Dee employed a crystal ball reader, or scryer, named Edward Kelley. Dee's records of the spiritual visions and messages received by Kelley, but never by Dee, are scattered across several manuscripts in the British Library. Sloan manuscript 3188 is the earliest of these, covering the period from December 1581 to May of 1583. Starting in March of 1583, Dee's notes contain dictations from a book said to be written in the angel's own language, what Dee calls a celestial speech, and which is supposed to have been revealed only to Enoch and a few other biblical figures. So for this reason, the language has come to be known as Enochian. Back in the 1970s, the linguistic characteristics of Enochian were examined by Donald Laycock, who wrote, "Statistical studies in linguistics show that patterning of this nature is rare in normal language, though it is found in poetry and magical charms. It is also characteristically found in certain types of meaningless language, such as glossolalia, that is, speaking in tongues, which is often produced under conditions similar to a trance. All the facts seem compatible with Kelley pouring out a string of gibberish while in a trance state." Now, I think he's being a bit too generous here. I'm not so sure that Kelley was actually in a trance. I think he's just a con artist. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that there's no evidence that Enochian encodes any sort of language, and it's best regarded rather as a species of invented gibberish. So, why might studying Enochian have any bearing on the Voynich? Especially since the claim that Kelley may have authored the Voynich took a major blow when the Voynich was carbon dated to the 15th century. Well, my thought was that Enochian represents an important sample of gibberish, one that comes from roughly the same historical milieu as the Voynich. Therefore, it may be able to shed light on the question of whether the Voynich is or isn't gibberish. To put it another way, writing 200 pages of gibberish sounds extremely hard to do. You'd think there'd have to be some sort of method to the madness. Enochian gives us one example of how to make extended passages of gibberish. You speak it out loud. Marlin o muspa agiad pangases may not mean anything, but it is perfectly easy to say. So, I was curious whether the Voynich might show signs it was composed in a similar way. Now, I think you can find pretty good quantitative support for the theory that Enochian is constructed this way. That is, that it's made from compounds of glossolalia-like monosyllables meant to be spoken out loud, by looking at just the frequency distribution of its characters. Here you can see that Enochian has this really distinctive dominance of one character, in this case the letter A, which clocks in at over 20%. This makes sense for a language that has phrases like gasmat, gasque, gasla, gasna, gasmaface, gasmagel, gasdunabe. Now, Enochian is hardly the only way to speak in tongues, but for what it's worth, the frequency distribution of Voynich characters does not exhibit this particular Enochian fingerprint. Enochian does, however, exhibit certain qualitative characteristics that happen to make the Voynich uniquely mysterious. The most important of these is token repetition, or epizeuxis. This has been the focus of my Voynich investigations from the beginning. Nearly 1% of all token pairs in the Voynich are direct repeats, and a handful of these, well, 10 to be exact, are repeated 3 times in a row. If these tokens are regarded as words, this would be extremely unusual for a natural language. For instance, there's not a single example of direct word repetition in the entirety of Caesar's Gallic Wars. On the other hand, if the tokens are regarded as subword units, like letters or bigrams, we would expect them to fall into certain patterns, which they don't. In Enochian, the tokens are explicitly words. We know this because occasionally Kelley translates some of them. And their direct repetition rate is about 0.15%. That is about 6 times less than the Voynich, but maybe 100 times more than a typical natural language text. So, qualitatively, the Voynich and Enochian share this odd characteristic, but quantitatively, the intensities are different by an order of magnitude. And so, once again, I think this is a result that shows the Voynich and Enochian to be more different than similar. But to me, the most striking way the Voynich and Enochian appear different is by looking at what I call their running fraction of hapax legomena. A hapax legomenon is a word that appears only once in a corpus. If you look at the running fraction of these for various texts, Enochian is the clear outlier, exhibiting a running fraction of hapax legomena that remains well above 50% for the entirety of the text. These numbers suggest strongly that there is no semantic content contained in the underlying text, and buttress the theory that the Enochian of Sloan manuscript 3188 is indeed gibberish. It's like reading from a list where none of the words repeat. But the most intriguing observation from this chart is that the Voynich does not exhibit this particular statistical fingerprint of Enochian. On the contrary, the Voynich, at least by this metric, appears more similar to natural language than it does to the gibberish of Enochian. And so, once again, you have a result where, at the quantitative level, the Voynich and Enochian end up looking more different than similar. Of course, this observation does not by itself provide evidence that the Voynich is or is not gibberish, but I do think it makes a strong argument that the Voynich cannot be gibberish in the same way that the Enochian of Sloan manuscript 3188 is gibberish. Thank you for listening. If you found this interesting, I encourage you to check out my article as well. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you very much.